In this module, we're going to be talking about everything related to transportation, including buying a car, leasing a car, and related topics. Okay, so let's ask a very basic question. Do you even need a car? And why is this an important question to ask yourself? Well, I think the obvious answer is because cars are pretty expensive. According to AAA, which is a insurance company, the average cost of owning a car can cost you about $10,000 per year. And this varies depending on the type of car you own. And it can go down to around 6,000 for a small sedan and around 10,000 for a pickup truck. And what does this include? It includes the cost of buying and financing, gas, insurance, maintenance. And I think it may be a kind of overestimate because it may assume that you get a new car every, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. That, of course, is not necessary. I've had my car for 14 years now. I bought it new. It was a small Toyota and it's still going. Has close to 200,000 miles. So I'm maybe an outlier, but my point is that you don't necessarily need to replace your car every 3 4 years like this estimate may indicate. But the point is that cars are expensive and the things like insurance, gas, registration, and if you're getting a loan on the car, the financing, they all add up. And so if you can avoid getting a car, then maybe you should consider doing that. Also, I think just framing the decision to buy a car or lease a car or have a car in general, you should think of a car as a tool. It's not an investment. And though it may seem, especially if you're younger, like a status symbol to have a nice car, it's really not financially kind of prudent to think of it as so because the car declines in value over time. So you're putting money into something that is just going to go down in value over time. So it's not an investment. An investment you want to increase in value or to provide you with cash flow. So a car is just a way to get around. It's just a tool. So if you can kind of mentally get over this societal pressure to have a nice car and kind of to use it as a signal to other people for your financial status, I would try to do that. What's cool isn't having a nice car. What's cool is having financial freedom and a large net worth. So I think if you can frame the decision like that, then you're doing yourself a favor. You can now ask yourself, do you need a car? So, for example, public transportation can be cheaper, more convenient in certain places around the country. So, especially in cities and in particular the East Coast cities. I lived in New York and Boston for a number of years, and during the time I was on the East Coast, I did not own a car. So, I think it was a good financial decision and just it was convenient too, just to not have to deal with parking a car living in a city. So you can even alter your living situation to forego the need for a car. You can live in a walkable neighborhood. You can, of course, live in an urban place that has good public transportation. And if you live in a place that is walkable or bikeable, you can also even have a car, but there are now services where you can share a car. So Zipcar and GigCar are two services where they basically have cars parked around. Uh, it's often urban centers, and you can just get a subscription to these services. Or I think even some of them are you just pay per time that you use the car. So you can just, if you really need a car to do something, you can just rent the car temporarily for a couple hours and use it, and then just park it somewhere else, and it's pretty convenient way to use a car but without owning one. Okay, and also check your budget. Can you even afford a car? And so your budget may allow you to own a car, but it may not allow you to own any kind of car. It may not allow you to buy a new car or lease a car. So you need to consult your budget, which will drive your decision on what kind of car you can get and afford, and even if you can get and afford a car. Okay, so now for many of you, you're gonna decide that you do want to own a car, or rather possess a car. So now let's talk about different ways that you can do that. So the first kind of set of options is to lease or own a car. So you basically buy a car. So when you own a car, you're buying the car with either cash or with a loan and own it until you sell it, trade it in, or get rid of it. So this is the most straightforward way for car possession is you just buy it. However, you can also lease it. So when you lease a vehicle, you're basically entering into a medium-term rental agreement with the dealer for a vehicle. So this is usually for 36 to 48 months, so 3 to 4 years, and you're basically renting the car. And so usually you have the option to buy the vehicle at the end of the lease term. The lease agreements will have some limitations and conditions for your use of the vehicle. So when you're renting it, you can't just basically go for free for all. For example, there will be a maximum number of miles per year that you can drive under the lease agreement. While if you own the car, you could do whatever you wanted. It requires full coverage insurance, which is more expensive. And it also requires gap insurance, which we're going to talk about later in the insurance portion of this module. And again, it's just an extra expense. And it will often require some kind of upfront down payment. So you'll have to still put up some chunk of money when you enter into a lease, usually. So if you're planning on buying the vehicle at the end of the lease, it may be worthwhile to put more down. Um, so there are some kind of strategies for if you're going to lease, and it just works out like that because you end up basically lowering your lease payment by putting more down up front. And a lease payment is basically just rent. Or it's like interest on a loan. You're just kind of paying that to the dealer, and you're not getting any value for it in terms of ownership for the lease payment. You're just paying a rent. So if you put more down up front, if you're going to be buying the vehicle at the end of the lease, then it may be worthwhile to put more down to lower your rental payment essentially. And also there are just a number of fees that you have to pay for a lease. So an acquisition fee, deposit, a disposition fee, early termination if you end the lease early. So it just adds a cost to using the vehicle to lease it. Okay, so we kind of mentioned some of these already, but let's go through the pros and cons of leasing. So the pros are typically the lease payment is lower than a similar term auto loan. So we're going to be talking about auto loans later, but basically the lease payment, since you're not paying any principal on a loan, is typically lower. So your monthly payment may be lower with a lease. Another pro is that you'll always be driving a new or new-ish car since the typical term for a lease is 3 to 4 years. You'll basically, if you choose to keep leasing after the end of the lease, you'll just release another new car. And so the most that your car is going to be is 3 or 4 years old if you perpetually lease a car. So some people may prefer that. And one big reason is because it's worry-free maintenance. Since you're driving a new car, typically it's going to be much less likely to break down. and the maintenance is covered by the dealer, so you don't have any maintenance issues to worry about. Also, if you're a small business owner, there's a tax benefit potentially, since you can write off the lease payment as a business expense if you're using the vehicle for business purposes. So some small business owners will lease a car and basically use the lease payment as a tax write-off. So it can basically lower the total cost of the lease, which may make it more preferable than owning the vehicle if you have this tax benefit. Okay, so what are the cons? The monthly payments are rent, so you're not building any equity. Basically, you're just paying a rent to the dealer and you're not actually gaining any more ownership of the car. You're just paying someone else for the right to use the car. So it's kind of dead money, you could say. At the end of the lease, you won't own anything. So this is kind of related. You'll just have to basically either buy the lease car at the end of the term so that you have something to drive, or enter into a new lease for another car. And so basically, you'll just be on a perpetual leasing treadmill. If you own the car, on the other hand, at some point your auto loan would be paid off, or if you bought the car all cash, you wouldn't have a payment at all and you just own the car. So with the lease, you're just, going to be potentially just making a payment for your vehicle perpetually. Okay, so let's just basically talk about some terminology that you might see if you do end up exploring the lease route. So there are two types of leases that are common. The first is a closed-end lease, also called a walkaway lease. So basically, there's no obligation for you to purchase the vehicle at the end of the lease term, though you might have the option. A closed-end lease can have the option for you to buy it. However, there's mileage limits that are pretty strict and fees if there's extra wear and tear or you exceed the mileage limits. And the reason for this is because the dealer at the end of the day will be responsible for the vehicle. So they want kind of some strict terms on your usage and the condition of the car at the end of the lease because they're going to basically be obligated to take it back. And so this is the more common type of lease because unlike the open-ended lease, which we're going to talk about, there's no potential for a surprise payment at the end. It gives you much more certainty as to what your payment is going to be and what the financial kind of planning you can expect for the lease is. So an open-ended lease, on the other hand, you, the leasee, are responsible for any changes to the car's residual value. So at the end of the lease term, you basically might have a big payment because in exchange for this responsibility for any changes in the car's residual value, you have less limitations on the use and the kind of condition you have to maintain the car at. So you're trading this flexibility for potentially having a large payment at the end of the lease to compensate the dealer for a lower residual value. For example, if you put extra mileage on the vehicle. So this type of lease is typically done by like people that own a bunch of leased vehicles because they want more flexibility on the mileage and kind of what they can do with the vehicles. So typically this is not a type of lease that most consumers like you or I would enter into. Okay, a term you'll see even when you're buying a car is the MSRP, and this stands for the manufacturer's suggested retail price. And basically, this is the kind of sticker price for a vehicle. Oftentimes, it's not actually what the vehicle sells for because the dealer has flexibility as to what they can sell a car for. But basically, the MSRP is the anchor point from which a negotiation can start. So leases are often based on the MSRP value of the car. And so Just so you understand what that term is. It's not the actual price the car sells for. It is just the sticker price or the kind of initial price that the car manufacturer sets for the price of the car. And then we have residual value, which is basically the car's value at the end of the lease term. And this is lower than the MSRP or kind of the initial price because cars decline in value over time, typically. And so the residual value is just the value of the car kind of over time at the end of the lease term. And there are different factors for that. The mileage of the car is probably the biggest one. Condition, if it's beat up, if it's been well maintained, deter- that will change the residual value. So these are kind of important terms to know if you're going to be considering a lease. And so finally, let's just summarize and I'll give you my recommendation. I think you should only lease if you really want to be driving a new car. It's not necessarily the most financially prudent decision because, again, you'll be on this lease treadmill indefinitely if you don't buy the car. So, it may not be the best financial decision, but if you really want to be driving a new car, then this is an avenue you could explore. It also could be advantageous if you are a small business owner or can somehow expense the lease payments, then potentially it could be the better option. But this is not the typical case for most people. So I would recommend not leasing and figuring out a way to buy a car.